all the traditional Christian towns in Palestine must have a Christian mayor. Terrorists is what I heard, like hiding out in the church. Good and evil with Islam on one side and God's chosen people. I feel like the land is the fifth gospel.
Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast. My name is Tim. I am your host, and today we are continuing season 8 as I interview authors of books that have really had a profound impact on me in the last year. So today I'm very excited to welcome author Mercy Aiken. She is not only the co-author of this amazing book, Yet in the Dark Streets Shining. Love the cover of this book, by the way. But she's also been a volunteer for a long time with the Bethlehem Bible College, which, as you guessed, it is in Bethlehem. She's also heavily involved in a growing thing called the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. Mercy, welcome to the Impact Nations podcast. So glad to have you.
Thank you so much, Tim. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here.
I have been very excited to talk to you, and I mentioned to you in an email the other day, I actually, after I finished the book, I handed it to my eldest daughter and said, hey, this is mandatory reading for you. She's in the 10th grade. I said, you have to read this as part of school this year. So she's already got started, and then I realized I needed it today, so I had to take it back from her again.
Nice. Makes me super happy that high schoolers are reading this book.
I think it's so important. It helped me understand a whole lot of what actually just the history of the last, I don't know what, 60 years or so, maybe more than that, actually, in the Middle East and what's been going on between Palestinians and Israelis and things like that. And really helps bring some perspective that I think is much needed in the evangelical world.
That was really one of the things that I was hoping for with the book, was that it provided an opportunity with Bishara's life, because he was a little boy in 1948. And so he lived through everything, like all the recent history that we know. And we often haven't heard how this history impacted Palestinians or Palestinian Christians. And so I just thought this is a fantastic opportunity to not just tell his story, but within the broader context.
Could you maybe just start with, just to get our bearings, who is Bishara Awad? What's, not his whole story, because you got to read the book for the whole story, but just kind of why Bishara?
Bishara is an amazing Palestinian Christian man who is in his 80s now. He is a real pillar of the Palestinian Christian community. He's been a leader. He and his whole family, I should say, they have been real leaders within the Palestinian Christian community. He founded Bethlehem Bible College, which is the only Bible college in the West Bank in Palestine. So there has since been a Catholic university that is open, but at the time there was no Christian higher education whatsoever in the occupied Palestinian territories. Bishara, through just his sheer gift of faith and visionary gift from the Lord, envisioned this and put it together. So that's who Bishara is. He's now retired from the Bible College, but he's still around a lot and very active.
The book actually begins modern day. You've got like a prologue that begins in this century and then jumps back. But I mean, it grips you from the very moment it begins, because you've got tanks rolling down the streets of Bethlehem, like crushing vehicles, and suddenly the gun of the cannon is turning, and he's worried it's going to aim right at his home and things like that. And it's even telling almost a very familiar story, as he's worried his grandchild is about to be born, and with the city on lockdown, suddenly his son and his daughter-in-law will not have a place to give birth, and so here they are in Bethlehem with nowhere to give birth. And I'm instantly thinking, like, well, this sounds familiar from 2000 years prior. I'm wondering, for you, as you became more and more familiar with the story of Bethlehem, of the Palestinians, did your reading of biblical texts change over time as you became more and more familiar with the history of Palestine?
Absolutely. My reading of biblical texts and the whole world, the American history, I mean, everything, it just became a touch point for a lot of things to shift for me. I grew up with a very typical evangelical view of the Middle East, of Israel, of Muslims, all of that. Like, I just sort of, especially in light of 9/11, and the Second Intifada, which is when I really started paying attention to what was going on over there. I had no real thoughts about Palestinians other than what a seething mass of violent people they seemed to be. And I remember actually the incident that you mentioned when Bishara is looking out his window and Bethlehem is being invaded by Israeli army, basically from like 5 different directions, and the Church of the Holy Nativity was under siege, and there were terrorists, is what I heard, like hiding out in the church. I remember that story, as a much younger person. I remember reading that in the news. I remember Bishara mentions this young girl who had suicide bombed herself, basically, from Dheisheh refugee camp, which is an area I know very well now, right in Bethlehem. I remember that story. It was on the cover of Newsweek because this 16-year-old Palestinian girl killed a 16-year-old Israeli girl when she exploded herself in a grocery store doorway. And those were the only 2 who were killed. These 2 girls, and they even kind of looked alike. So it was sort of shocking, like it was on the cover of Newsweek. And I remember I bought that magazine and I carried it around with me. So all these years later, then I find myself in Bethlehem and I'm hearing a different side of the story, what it was like for the people in Bethlehem, most of whom are Christian, or not most now. They're actually a minority, even in Bethlehem, but it's still a very, very Christian city in terms of its tradition. And the mayor of Bethlehem, for example, always has to be a Christian. This is the law of the Palestinian Authority, because Bethlehem is such a Christian city. What my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ were going through during that time, which I hadn't really considered. And I remember even when I was following the story as a young person, I didn't really understand. I couldn't quite follow it. It didn't really make sense because I didn't really understand what was going on over there.
Yeah.
So yes, my theology has been challenged a lot. My eschatology has shifted from, I was raised more to look at the Bible or interpret the Bible as, when it came to prophetic, like what is God doing, what's about to be fulfilled, and how can we figure out what time it is on God's clock, and what are the signs that we're supposed to be looking for to let us know maybe this means that from the Bible, and maybe this over here incident that's happening, or this person, this leader that rose up is fulfilling this part of scripture. And that's what I understood as prophetic when I was a young Christian. Of course, it was a long journey from there to where I am now, but living in the occupied Palestinian territories, I really quickly began to understand there's a completely different understanding of prophetic, which is actually speaking God's heart about injustice and about oppression and domination of poor and helpless people and marginalized people. And this is just one of the things that really stuck out to me. It was like there's these 2 different ideas of what it means to be prophetic or a prophet as far as people read the Bible, and they're facing each other, one on like one side of the separation wall and the other on the other side of the separation wall, looking at each other in complete disagreement with what it means to be prophetic and what is God's heart and what is God's desire right now.
Well, and that even led to the loss of a major funding source for Bishara and the college. You tell a story of of him basically going and being confronted with that very thing. I mean, it's shocking. He's in a worship prophetic meeting of intercession meeting of some kind, and suddenly it's announced, I believe God is calling us to raise money to be able to purchase a tank for the Israelis. And he's, of course, distraught, saying, don't you understand that tank is very likely going to lead to the death of some of your brothers and sisters in Palestine? And when she just comes right out and asks him, hey, do you believe that that Israel has a right to that land and needs to occupy that land in order to bring about the end times? And he just gives a flat no.
Right.
And that's the end. And he has to stand up for what he believes in, and loses a significant funding source because of that. I can't imagine the pain of even having been in that meeting to see this happening.
I know.
Ugh.
Yeah, when I heard that story, I was just like, and he just told it in this kind of offhand way, like he's just recounting all these different stories. And when he told me that, I just felt my jaw like fall, like, wow, raising money, like hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase a tank for the IDF. And Bishara is the only Palestinian sitting in the audience. You know, everyone else is praising the Lord and weeping as they're making these sacrificial gifts to support the Jewish people, not realizing the implications of what that means for their brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's one of the reasons that I felt really compelled to tell this story, is because the voice of Palestinian Christians sort of throws a wrench into the easy peasy way that the West and the Western church has understood the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I've heard a lot, I grew up in more in a charismatic, Pentecostal charismatic type of expression. And so it was, you know, the spiritual battle between light and darkness and good and evil, with Islam on one side and God's chosen people, the Jews, on the other side. And so if you're just looking at it in that context, you can support or appreciate a lot of the things that go on over there. But then if you understand, actually, in the middle of all this, there are Christians who are part of an ancient Christian community who, as far as they're concerned, trace themselves back to the beginning of the church, which began in the Middle East. Like, they are our forefathers in the faith, is how I look at them. That's how I look at Middle Eastern Christians. And I wish the West could see that more and honor that more, because that's where our faith began. Who are being wiped out, who are literally disappearing from the land, who are being destroyed out of this place where they have had this ancient contiguous presence for millennia. It's on such a thin edge now, not just in Israel, Palestine, but across the Middle East. And so much of that has to do with our support in the West of military conquest that we are putting as a template of like light versus darkness and good versus evil. Yeah. And you know, who's part of the fallout of that? The Christian community. So I think the more that we can highlight Christian voices from the Middle East who are saying these things, the more it can make us, it throws a wrench into what looks like something that's very easy and simple to understand. It makes it a lot more complicated immediately. And if that's the only thing that people can take away from it, like, my views are going to be a little more complicated now, it's not as simple as I thought, that's great. You know, at least you're beginning to ask some hard questions that are long overdue and should have been asked a long time ago.
Yeah, and I again just would recommend this book wholeheartedly to those who are struggling and who maybe need the wrench. As you're listening to this, you go, I need somebody to throw a wrench into my thinking of this to slow me down and help me understand. And this, what this does actually, Mercy, is it builds empathy, right? Because suddenly you are in, not just in Bishara's space, but like with his family. And you do this brilliant job of telling his story of his family over generations, right? From his mother and everything all the way through. And suddenly we can't help but ignore, because we feel like we know some of these people now. So I would recommend to our listeners, our viewers, if you just want to re-examine a little bit something that maybe you just accepted because that's just what the church has always said, which is unfortunately, so many of our beliefs come down to, well, that's just what the church has always said. That's what I was taught. And we don't actually stop and slow down and ask some of the hard questions about what the church has said. Mercy, I wonder, can you tell us, maybe just give us a little bit of, I don't want to set up a straw man here, but what has the traditional evangelical understanding eschatology been in terms of the region and traditional, the Palestinian Israeli land that has been fought over for so long? What is the evangelical view, perhaps the biblical understanding, the biblical basis for that view? Where's that come from?
Are you talking about how most people see it that I may find erroneous now, maybe, that I
Yes.
once
Yeah,
believed.
exactly. Yeah. Like,
Okay.
and I think that, like I say, a lot of our listeners and viewers probably actually just mentally, they have come to a conclusion or been given a conclusion and maybe don't know why that is. And
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
and then we'll tear it down a little bit afterwards.
Yeah. Well, for myself, I can just speak how I understood it. The Jews were God's chosen people. They were banished out of the land for their sin or for some reason. That was a little vague, but they weren't in the land anymore.
Yeah.
But God brought them back because we are now in the end days, and Jesus Christ is returning very soon. And one of the signs of that is that he's gathered Israel, the chosen people, back into the land, so that things like Matthew 24, all these eschatological prophetic words can now be fulfilled, because
Yeah.
they weren't ever fulfilled. Like, never once growing up did I ever hear, maybe some pastors did and I missed it, but I don't ever recall anybody even teaching that there's at least one layer of fulfillment that's already happened here. Jesus was actually speaking what was to come in that generation. Everything was set off into the future. None of that had been fulfilled yet. That was what I grew up believing.
Yeah.
The Jewish people were looked upon almost as like the great proof that the Bible is true. I heard people even say things like that. Like, if you want to know, if you need proof that the Bible is true, look at the Jews. Here, all these years later, God has gathered them back into the land as he said he would do, in Ezekiel or in Jeremiah. Again, not taking into context any other historical fulfillment that might have already taken place. So for Jesus to come back, this is where it starts getting pretty fuzzy for me, to be honest, because now I'm a little more critical when I listen to some of these prophetic words that people are saying. Like, one time I saw a big televangelist on a big Christian TV station. I don't know that I need to say which one, but he was helping the Israeli National Fund plant olive trees in the Negev desert. And I don't know if he knew this, but this particular project was designed to move Bedouin people, to sweep them out of their roaming way of lifestyle in the Negev into these townships, which were like basically big cement slums that they did not want to live in. It's like pushing them into some sort of reservation ghetto type of idea, so they can put like more military bases and things like that. Anyway, here's this evangelist up there going, "We are greening the desert. We are fulfilling the word of God. The Lord told me, plant a tree for my son, hasten the coming of the Lord, and plant a tree for my son." I'm thinking, what in the world does planting a tree in the Negev and moving all the Bedouin out of their traditional way of life possibly have to do with Jesus returning? Like, the Lord is sitting in heaven, like twiddling his fingers, waiting for all the Bedouin to be moved out of the Negev and like other things before he can come back. That's where it breaks down for me. And I'm probably not the best person to really explain this in a sympathetic way anymore, because it's just, I guess I've spent too much time with it from the Palestinian perspective. But essentially, let me say this to be generous. I do believe this. There's also a lot of much needed support for Jewish people and recognition of Christian anti-Semitism for millennia, for centuries in Europe, culminating with the Shoah, but not limited to the Shoah, like so much that went on. And the Western Christian world is rightly contrite about that and rightly rethinking, how do we relate with Jewish people? And I think a lot of that has also been kind of laid on top of Israel. Like, I would have never been a Nazi and I will never be one now. Like, I will support the Jewish people now through thick and thin, no matter what they're facing or what they're doing.
So it's like the pendulum has swung really far to the other side.
Yeah, I feel that
Yeah, he was born in 39. So he's
Yes.
born just, and the story kind of picks up in 48. So there is this, the pendulum has now swung, because I think the world is saying to themselves, oh my goodness, what have we allowed to happen during Nazi Germany's awful atrocities towards the Jews? And so there is this like, we've got to, the world is saying we're going to make this right, in a sense, I think.
Right.
It's at the cost of the Palestinians. And you're
Right.
right. The problem is, of course, well, what do we do now? We want to be, we want to bless both of those people groups, nations, however you want to say it.
Yes.
And yet there's only so much space. So
Right.
we're not going to solve peace in the Middle East today on this program. Sorry if you were tuning in today to solve peace in the Middle East, not your show. We'll leave that to presidents.
I wish we could right now. Wouldn't that be great?
One of the things that's amazing about Bishara's story is the number of times that Muslim families, individuals, even organizations actually step in to help them, to help Bishara and his family and his schools and things like that. I wondered, can you just speak to us a little bit about the relationship between Christians and Muslims? Bethlehem, as you mentioned, is still very much even though it's not majority Christian, it's still very much a Christian city, although I don't think that's the case necessarily around Palestinian territory. What's the relationship like? Has it evolved since the 40s?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, a lot of Palestinians will say, and even I've talked to people, Jewish people whose family lived in that land prior to 48. And contrary to how a lot of people understand it, there was not uniformity of opinion among Jews about what should happen with this land. But most people will say, back then we lived side by side, more or less in peace, like recognizing that we live in a very multicultural, multi-religious, faceted part of the earth that is very sacred to three religions. And we try to respect that. It wasn't always perfect, and I don't want to give that impression. And I think people who are truthful about it won't give that impression either. But it certainly was not this idea that we have sort of observed in the West, that Muslims and Jews have always been fighting each other. That was absolutely not the case. And nor were Christians. I mean, again, it was up and down. It would depend on what sort of Muslim government, just like with Christian governments or Jewish governments or any other. They can wax and wane. They can have better leaders or worse leaders, more leaders who want to create a space of freedom for a diversity of people, or those who want to dominate, with their one brand. So the Holy Land had that, certainly. But Christians and Muslims have mostly lived side by side in peace in that land. I feel fair in saying that, because that is what I've read and that is what I've heard firsthand. And that is also what I've observed living in Bethlehem even today. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Palestinian Authority made a law. I thought it was fascinating that all the traditional Christian towns in Palestine must have a Christian mayor. And part of that is to preserve the Christian presence in the land and not have their voice, because they're a minority now, be completely obscured. So the mayor of Ramallah always has to be a Christian too. Ramallah is a traditional Christian village. And when I first came to Bethlehem, the mayor was a Christian woman. And so this was just very different from the stereotypical way that I had been sort of led to see the Muslim world, which is wherever there's Muslims in majority, Christians are suffering. And if Christians are suffering in the Middle East, it's because of Muslims. That's not the case. There's a lot of beautiful coexistence and friendship and support. And especially as the occupation of the West Bank has just gone on. It's gone on now for what, 60, 70 years? I forget how long it's gone on now, since 1967. The Palestinian, whether Christian or Muslim, they see themselves more as two people who are sharing in the same sufferings. So that sort of unites them, because they're both living under the military occupation.
As the world gets smaller, so to speak, with the advent of social media and online news, things like that, How do Palestinian Christians, how's their relationship with the West shifted over time, as they're probably becoming more exposed to the kind of that traditional eschatology, end times, evangelical viewpoint? Um, do they feel more and more isolated as they learn more of that? Like Bishara was a unique case in that he ended up actually with American citizenship and was traveling back and forth and stuff. So he was exposed to that probably sooner than most of his countrymen.
Yeah, I think that they've been pretty aware of it for a long time. Maybe the extent of it, as the Israeli-Palestinian situation has continued, it's raised up. More Christians have sort of, I don't want to use the word extremism, but they have sort of taken an increasingly extreme position. There have been more groups that have arisen in the Christian world that have been raised up specifically to support settlements or to support the IDF or to support, the most right-wing elements of the Israeli government. And so as the Western Christian world has taken more and more of that position, I think maybe in the early days, I don't know that it was the dominant position in the Christian world in the West. There were some who believed that this was a fulfillment of prophecy, and others who were like, I don't know. Now it's much more of a dominant position, at least in some quarters, or at least those who hold it are much more organized and loud and have raised a lot more money. As that has happened, Palestinian Christians, particularly Palestinian evangelicals, have begun to organize. Like, if anyone can speak to this, we have to speak to it. So many theologians, such as like Munther Isaac, who is he's the chair of Christ at the Checkpoint, the pastor of Christmas Lutheran Church, an academic dean at Bethlehem Bible College. He's written a few very good books. One of them is this one right here. I don't know if you can see it. It's called From Land to Lands, From Eden to the Renewed Earth. And I really recommend this book if you want to get into some theology of the land. Johanna Catenaccio is another. There are other Palestinian voices who are speaking to this situation now very strongly, very clearly, very, very scripturally, very thoroughly, very compassionately. And then they developed this Christ at the Checkpoint conference, which they do every 2 years. And it is specifically to reach out to American evangelicals, or Western global evangelicals, I should say, because they don't want to limit it. Frankly, they felt they worked a lot with the West, and now they're more interested in bringing in voices from the global South and other parts of the global church, because this is sort of a global issue that does concern the whole body of Christ. Yeah. But yeah, they're working very hard to engage, and they're doing it very smartly. Their scholarship is incredible. And when I read their books and I think, wow, this person is writing in better English than me, and this is like their second or third language. It's really incredible, the scholarship that is coming out from the Palestinian community.
I want to talk a little bit about what it's like to be a Christian, or what it was like to be a Christian still, I think, in the context of an occupied Palestine. I was incredibly humbled and challenged as a follower of Christ to see the ongoing sacrifice, the ongoing daily choice to love your enemy, of Bishara and his family. There's one story, I'm trying to remember who it was. I don't even remember. I read the book so fast, but where somebody's come to actually basically displace them from their home, take all of their appliances and everything. And the owner of the home actually just says, we'll come have tea with us first, and then we will help you load up all of our stuff into your truck to take it away and steal our things. And they help load the truck. They become the moving crew. And I just thought, like, wow, talk about turning the other cheek. Talk about walk an extra mile. That is shocking.
Yeah.
Christ-like behavior. And I mean, as I'm reading these stories, I'm filled with rage, and I'm sure they were too. And yet they made the choice every time, or I mean, most of the time, to turn the other cheek. What's it like to be a Christian there?
Oh, yeah. When I saw those astounding examples of Christ-like behavior, like you, I was just floored, and I was like, these stories have got to be included in the book.
Yeah.
Even just being at the Bible college and seeing how, like, the Bible college is situated on Hebron Road, and it's in between two refugee camps. So whenever there's a demonstration, young men from the refugee camps mostly are the ones, they'll come out on the street, and the separation wall is just right there, like literally a stone's throw, no pun intended, distance, with a big watchtower and a big military gate. And so, the Israeli army would come out, tear gas, skunk water, stun grenades, all kinds of, sometimes even live bullets and things would be flying on the street right in front of the college, while people are sitting in a room studying the book of Matthew, or, studying the Beatitudes, or studying, counseling or trauma or whatever. There's a lot of trauma in this community to the sounds of all this going on. And I found for myself, it was very, very hard to even concentrate anymore. Like at first I would try to be very spiritual and read the Bible or pray, or like sing worship songs over the, and I was like, finally, like, I can't concentrate so well. It makes you a little bit ADHD. So when I see the way that some of these people who have lived this way for their entire life, like it's never not been this way for them, and they're 70 years old now, and their face is full of light and peace and gentleness. Yes, rage at times. Yes, they're human. Yes, they have to work through the issues of forgiving or recognize within themselves when they don't feel as much compassion if they hear about an Israeli getting killed, and just kind of like, oh, like, I don't have time to grieve that. I'm too busy grieving all of this. But yet some of them will go, wait a minute, I saw that in my heart, and Lord, I know that you grieve for them too. Help me to feel what you feel. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found very remarkable in my time with the Palestinian Christians is that they're often teaching on the Beatitudes. They're often wrestling with the verse about forgiving your enemies or turning the other cheek. They talk about it a lot, way more than I heard probably my whole life growing up in sermons. Like, I probably heard more sermons and discussions on these topics in 1 year than I did the rest of my life put together in the American church, in terms of just topics that I think people are preaching on it more now. Mm-hmm. I think there's been kind of a change, even just like in the past 5 or 6 years, or maybe I'm just hearing it more now. But for Palestinians, this is very real. Their enemy is not, someone who snubbed them at church or whatever. This is like life and death.
Their situation, ironically, there's such great irony here, but their situation is exactly that which Jesus was teaching in the midst of, right? He was teaching to an occupied people whose homeland was occupied by the Romans, and he's talking to them about how to love your enemy. And for them, like you said, their enemy is not the guy who cut them off in traffic. These are people, these are occupiers. And ironically, 2,000 years later, the people that Jesus were talking to, that people group, are now the occupiers. But these believers, these followers of Jesus, are hearing his words in the very same context. Whereas those of us in nations in the West, it's really hard for us to place ourselves in the shoes of the hearers, right? Because that's not been our experience. And yet these texts must come alive to Palestinians in a way that they can't possibly to us.
Yes. And that's one of the things that kind of makes me smile, because people always talk about the land, the Holy Land, being the fifth gospel. And once you get there, once you see like what that mountain looked like and how close it was to that lake, wow, then you really get the feeling of what it was like for Jesus, and yes, all of that's true. And yes, all of that's beautiful. But I feel like the land is the fifth gospel in ways that we're just, or at least I myself am really now beginning to see in terms of how the context in which the gospel was birthed, so much of it is not dissimilar, to what is happening today. It is a fantastic place to wrestle. And I've seen, I will say, even Christians come over there almost losing their faith, because you expect to come to the Holy Land. You have these high hopes, almost like this Disneyland, type of immersive experience. And you're going to walk home, floating on angel dust, and, because you levitated 3 feet in the upper room and were dunked in the Jordan River or whatever. And yet it's really the place to go deep into our faith. And one of the things I think for people who are like in this deconstruction mode, if they can see how Palestinian Christians are living out the gospel in the context. And I will also include in that, there are some very, very beautiful Messianic Jewish friends that I personally am acquainted with who are doing the same thing on their side of the wall. And when you see people really engaging in a deep way with the gospel in that land, it gives you courage to keep going on as a Christian. And I'm just throwing that out there for people who are feeling that the heaviness of everything that's going on in the world right now. These people are, in my view, because their voices have been so marginalized, there's a real power in them. The Lord has always sort of spoken from the margins and from the cracks, not so much from the noisy middle. And when we can calm ourselves down enough to actually listen to these voices from the margin, that's where I think the medicine that we need, that's where it is coming from.
Bishara does, in the story, befriend on some occasions some Israelis, and they kind of begin to bridge that gap. Is that common, or like, is there a lot of relationship between the two that we don't hear about?
Yeah, it's up and down, and it's in and out. It was easier back in the day before there was the separation wall. Now Israelis and Palestinians are more physically separated by a real barrier than ever. So there's less interaction, and those who do interact have to work much harder to make it happen, because there's very few neutral places where people can meet, and to do so requires great effort. But I'm inspired by some of these friendships that I have seen, that people have very stubbornly retained in spite of all the obstacles against them retaining that friendship. And like, I know Israelis who will, I don't know if I should say this, but they will come into areas where technically they shouldn't go, because they have a Palestinian friend there who they love and care about, and they will meet. Or there's a lot of people in both communities who frown on this, because for Palestinians, they see it as normalization. You're normalizing this very unnatural situation and making it look like if all we did was just meet together and get along, then the situation would end. And that's not really the case. There's deep entrenched political realities that are moving on regardless of how many times people get together and play frisbee or something like that. But all the same, that work on the ground is very, very valuable. I think not just for the personal souls and friendships of those people living there, but as a testimony to those around them, that there is a different way. And whatever you've been hearing in your media telling you there is no different way, this friendship right here disproves that and shows that that's not the case.
Bishara's brother, Mubarak, was a nonviolent agitator. He spent time in the American South learning. He was in Tennessee learning about Dr. King and his nonviolent resistance, and tried to bring that back with him to Palestine. And varying degrees of success, I suppose. But it's interesting because it challenges it challenges us to, like, is there more than one way to stand up for justice? Because some of his others, colleagues were stone throwers, if you will, and were engaged in more, I don't know, violent methods of showing protest. And then others, like Bishara admits, like, hey, that was his calling, not mine. I wasn't really actually to be out in front. I was to be in the background. I understood my calling was the Bible college and to train up Christian leaders, whereas Mubarak was more of the agitator, nonviolent agitator. But it had me wondering, like, what do you think? Do each of us have different roles to play? Like, is there an anointing for some to actually be agitators, so to speak, in their faith? Like, as you said, more of a prophetic people being out front saying, hey, we need to stand for justice. And there are others who have a quieter, more background role to play.
I am very, very convinced of that. And I very much dislike this idea that there's one template or one way to be in solidarity or be an advocate or do the Lord's work in regard to any complex situation. Because the Lord's gifted all of us differently, and he's given all of us different callings, and not everyone can do the same thing. And there's a lot of things that need to be done. Yeah. So that, I thought that was beautiful, because that was actually a question that I posed to Bishara too. Like, did you feel that you should have been joining Mubarak, or did you feel that he was stepping out of the bounds of what is a proper Christian behavior? And he just said, no, I was very proud of Mubarak for what he did. I thought it was wonderful what he did, and I totally supported him. And, but I knew what I was called to do.
But he understood his role was different.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a really important lesson for all of us, because sometimes I think we look at another Christian brother or sister who is anointed in a different way, and we think, gee, I need to be doing the same thing. And yet there is no cookie cutter solution. And the Lord has anointed us and appointed us to different roles, and we need to embrace that which we've been given.
And I see division sometimes happening, like I'll use the Palestinian Christian community for an example, but there are some who feel we need to be very aggressively outspoken on theological issues, and others who are like, no, we really need to just try to maintain the peace with our brothers and sisters in Christ and build relationship with them. Or we need, and it's very, very complicated. I can't even explain all of it right now. But some of these people get mad at each other because they feel they're doing it wrong. And I'm like, or even outside advocates like myself and other Americans or Westerners or others who come in. And I just feel like we need all hands on deck. So yeah, just repeating myself, but we need all hands on deck. And whatever the Lord has called you to do, do it as unto him with all your heart, and may he be glorified.
For those of us in the West who are not in the thick of it, not positioned as Bethlehem Bible College is between two refugee camps and the whole mess, what can we do? Like, how do we help promote peace? Or, I don't know, what role do we have to play?
First of all, I think we should approach this situation with a very humble heart and a willingness to learn and be taught new things. Yeah. And that concerns both Eastern Christians, it concerns Muslims, and it also concerns Jews and Israelis. And I think we need to take a very humble heart to all of these groups, and we need to listen. We need to educate ourselves. If we can actually afford it and have the time and make it work so that we can go to the Holy Land in person and see with our own eyes and meet people and talk to them from across the spectrum. Don't just go wanting to hear one type of voice or one type of message. Expose yourself to Christians and Muslims and Jews. Go into a diversity of places, see what's going on. Would be my first suggestion. Like, first, read, listen to podcasts, meet, do what you can, then go there. After that, I will say, however the Lord leads you. Again, there's this diversity of the body, and I don't believe there is a cookie cut answer for that. Some people may want to become like politically involved, like calling their representatives more or going to Capitol Hill and talking. Others may want to begin addressing the issue in their church. Like, why don't we read this book together as a small group and talk about it? Or those who are in leadership and who are theological teachers may want to, start delving into this very messy, sticky, controversial world that might split their congregation, but they may want to risk it, for the sake, because I've come to see this situation is not just this conflict in Israel, Palestine, but I feel there's a lot of repercussions that are bearing upon the global body of Christ, and certainly us as North American Christians and evangelicals in particular. I feel that real engagement with this issue and a real humility to learn the truth, historical truth, and really try to get down, and I don't say this in a pompous way, we're all always forever learning, but to rethink some of the assumptions we've had theologically. It will be a reformation for us, and it will be good for us. I think we will come out better on the other side, looking more Christ-like and living into our calling as ambassadors of Christ in this earth in a much more effective way. And so that's why I'm passionate about this issue for more reasons than one. It's just a touchstone for so many things, I think, that the Lord wants to do within the hearts of his people.
I'm glad you mentioned going to the Holy Land, because Impact Nations is doing that, actually. So I want to extend an invite. If you hadn't heard, Impact Nations is hosting a trip to Israel, and this is going to be one of those, I think you would agree, Mercy, one of those multi-viewpoint trips. You're going to get a view from the other side of the wall, so to speak, and see what life is like for Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims as well. So if you haven't signed up, there's still time, but there's very little time. You got to sign up. I think it's November 1st is the registration deadline, and the trip is almost full. So don't delay. If you're thinking about it, push the button. You don't want to miss out on this. I'm going to be there. My wife's going to be there. Mom and dad are going to be there, and a whole bunch of the Impact Nations family. But we're going to be led by Brian and Perry Zond. And Mercy, I know you and Perry actually spent a lot of time together in Israel. You guys lead trips designed specifically for women. So I think you would say with confidence that the Zonds are pretty good at providing a very well-rounded understanding, a very well-rounded tour of the region. Yeah.
You're not going to find a better Bible teacher to take you through the Holy Land than Brian Zond. I'll say that for sure. Yeah, I'm really excited for you guys. Super thrilled that you guys are going to be doing this.
I'm going to be requesting in a few months, once we've got the entire team already assembled and ready to go. We're going, by the way, I should say, I didn't say the dates. Bad job. We're going in November of 2024. So that's a little over a year from now. So you got time to save up, you got time to make it happen, but you got to register in order to get on that trip, because the deadline is this year. It's this November to go next November. But once we've got that whole team assembled, I'm actually going to be asking that every member of the team read this book, Mercy, because I think it is incredibly helpful for building empathy, for beginning to whet the appetite of like what we're going to experience. And honestly, for me, and this is one of the reasons why I'm asking my kids, both my teenagers are going to read this, but it provoked a curiosity for me to go and do some further research on the history of the region, because I wanted to understand some of the background as Bishara is telling his story. I wanted to understand, hey, what was happening on a grander scale politically at that time and things like that. And so yeah. I think by reading this, our team is actually going to be provoked to go do some more research and come even more full of knowledge, which will just make our experience in Israel that much more profound, because we've got some of that background already, and everything will start to click into place a little bit. That's
really exciting. I'm so happy to hear that.
Mercy, I have so many questions still written down, but we're just going to tell people you got to read the book. But if people if they want to learn more about you and some of what you're up to, how can people find you? What are you up to these days?
I work for an organization called Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, and you can find us at NEME.network and sign up for our newsletter. We send something out once a month, kind of updating people on important things that are going on, especially in Israel, Palestine, but the Middle East in broad also. We lead also trips over there. If anyone's interested in coming to Christ at the Checkpoint, I'd love for you to contact me. That it's going to be in May of 2024. And you can
What is
email
Christ at the Checkpoint? Tell us a little bit about
Christ at the Checkpoint is a Christian conference. It's sort of one of the arms of Bethlehem Bible College, although it is independent now from the college. It's still how can it be connected and independent? It is.
Affiliated.
Yeah, every 2 years. So international speakers are invited in. The evangelical Christian world broadly is invited in to come with Palestinian Christians and help us wrestle with the theological implications of what is going on here in this land. Try to put yourself in our shoes. And how would you feel about some of these things that you're talking about? Look at the separation wall right there. Look at the checkpoint. How do we live our faith in light of this? How can we as a global church community make a difference and make this help be a positive voice of change into this situation, rather than helping entrench the status quo and make it worse, which is what much of the church, unfortunately, I think with good intentions, but has been doing. So yeah, that's going to be in May of 2024. I will be there and would love to see any of you guys there. Yeah, check us out on NIMI. We do webinars on peacemaking. If you're interested in the Middle East and want to learn more, we're having a retreat in Phoenix this fall. If you'd be interested in coming, just email me, mercy@nimi.network, and I'll be happy to chat with you about any of these things.
Fantastic. Well, there you go. If you're not available next November, then make yourself available to get to Christ at the Checkpoint, because that sounds amazing too. My goodness, so many great options. Nimi.network is the place to go to learn all about that stuff, and follow along with Mercy's work. This has been amazing. I've so enjoyed your book. Please pass on my thank you to Bishara as well. You guys did an amazing job. My understanding is basically you were interviewing him effectively. You tell this story from the first person perspective. It's ostensibly an autobiography, and yet I know you wrote it. That was just based on interviews with him and some family members and colleagues. Yeah.
Yes.
How long did it take to write this book?
Well, collecting the interviews, and piecing the story together was quite a bit of work, as much work as actually writing it, really. So how long did it take? A few years, doing the research and then writing it. Yeah, I don't remember exactly. Maybe two.
Final product is fantastic.
Thank you so much.
And humbling and challenging, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to everybody. So
thank you so much. That really means a lot.
Your perspective is so helpful for us, and I hope it's piqued curiosity. Maybe you've ruffled a few feathers, rattled a few cages, which is wonderful. That's what we like to do here at the Impact Nations podcast. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Folks, we are here at the Impact Nations podcast every Thursday. This season 8, I'm chatting with a different author every single week. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you've been enjoying it. We'd love to hear from you, by the way, if you want to write to us at podcast@impactnations.com. I always love feedback from our listeners. I know you guys are coming from all over the globe. We are available on YouTube every Thursday at 6 p.m. You can check that out at YouTube/@ImpactNations. That's our handle there. And by the way, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get the notification, you know the deal. But the reason is not only are you going to get notified every week of a new podcast episode, but also very often, Jordan, who actually helps produce this podcast, she's our project manager. She's uploading awesome videos. Bill, our Journey of Compassion manager, he actually also is overseeing our organic gardening stuff. I know he's working right now on getting some videos done. So all that stuff gets put onto YouTube, so you can see these amazing stories of God's kingdom coming and bringing transformation to communities in the developing world. So you don't want to miss that stuff too. So be sure to follow us on YouTube, hit the bell, get the subscription and the notifications, all the things. If you prefer audio, you can get the audio of this podcast delivered to your device every single week, so you can listen to it on your way to work. Don't listen to it while you're at work, because you have to be working, but you can listen to it on your way. So just subscribe Impact Nations podcast on any of your favorite podcast applications. Thank you so much for being with us. We will see you again next week. God bless you.